He could have bought any five-star restaurant in Italy, but Matteo Viteri chose to buy the rundown building where Giulia's tavern stood. It was a clear message from the mob boss. He had marked his territory, and Giulia was now locked in it with him. The car ride was dead silent. Giulia sat stiffly in the back seat of Matteo's black limousine, wearing the red silk dress that felt alien against her skin. The dress fit perfectly, as if Matteo had known her measurements down to the last millimeter. The thought made her nauseous. They arrived at a massive villa outside the city, hidden behind high iron gates and lush trees. Matteo's house was beautiful, but cold. Vast marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and abstract modern art adorned the walls. There were no family photos, no warmth, no signs of real life. It was a museum, not a home. "Welcome," Matteo said. He led her to a grand dining room. A long mahogany table was set for two at opposite ends. Candles were lit, reflecting light off the silverware. Servants silently served the food. Ironically, the food tasted bland to Giulia. It was elaborate fine dining, foie gras, truffles. The kind of food Matteo hated, Giulia thought bitterly. She missed the warmth of her own soup. "Eat," Matteo said from the other end of the table. "You look thin." Giulia just pushed her food around. "What do you want from me, Matteo? You already have my building. You already destroyed my friend's life. What else?" Matteo set down his wineglass. His voice echoed in the large room. "Look around you, Giulia. All of this could be yours." He stood up and walked slowly toward Giulia. "You live in fear. Fear of not making rent. Fear of thugs. Fear of the future. I can take all that fear away. You will never be cold again. You will never be hungry again." He stopped behind Giulia's chair, placing his hands on her bare shoulders. "I can give you the world, safety, power, anything you want." Giulia tensed under his touch. "And the price?" Matteo leaned down, his lips brushing Giulia's ear. "You, completely forever, no more resistance." He swiveled Giulia's chair so they were facing each other. "Be mine, Giulia, stop fighting me. It's exhausting, isn't it?" The offer hung in the air. It was the easy way out, surrender, let herself drown in this, luxury and forget her morals. Many people would kill for this offer, but Giulia looked into the cold eyes of the man before her. She saw the emptiness there. "You offer a golden cage," Giulia said softly, "but it's still a cage." "A cage?" Matteo repeated, his voice low, dangerous. He stepped back, as if insulted by the word. "I offer you a kingdom and you call it a cage?" "Yes," Giulia said, standing slowly. Her legs trembled, but her voice was steady, "because I don't have the choice to leave. That's the definition of a prison, Matteo." Matteo stared at her with new intensity. No longer cold desire, but hot anger. He wasn't used to being rejected after giving everything. "You think you have a choice out there?" he asked cynically. "In your pathetic little trattoria? You're a slave to your bills, to your customers, to your fear of poverty. At least here you'd be a queen." "I'd rather be poor but free," Giulia retorted. "I'd rather have my own life, however small, than be a pretty doll on your collector's shelf." Matteo's face hardened. His mask of calm cracked. "You don't understand," he growled, stepping forward until he towered over Giulia. "I'm not asking if you want to be mine. I'm telling you that you are mine." He gripped Giulia's upper arms, his fingers pressing into her flesh. "I've been patient, Giulia. I've played nice. I bought you your building. I got rid of the pests bothering you. I fed you dinner. And you still dare look at me like I'm a monster. Because you are a monster," Giulia yelled, her fear finally exploding into anger. "You burned Paolo's boat. You threatened me. You think you can buy people like you buy buildings? You know nothing about love or real ownership." Those words hit Matteo like a physical slap. His grip on Giulia's arms tightened painfully. "You want to see a monster?" he whispered, his eyes pitch black. "Fine." He pulled Giulia roughly, dragging her away from the dining table toward the grand staircase leading upstairs. "Let me go!" Giulia screamed, struggling, but Matteo was too strong. "You want to be mine the hard way? We can do it the hard way," Matteo growled. "Tonight, you'll learn that no is not a word that applies in this house." He dragged her up the stairs, toward the master bedroom. Every step was a death knell for Giulia's remaining freedom. She knew what was going to happen, and she knew she had to fight him, even if it was the last thing she did. Matteo dragged her into the massive master bedroom. It was a cold room, dominated by a huge bed with black silk sheets. He threw Giulia toward the bed. Julia fell, but adrenaline made her scramble up instantly. Her eyes scanned the room frantically, searching for an exit, searching for a weapon. Nothing, just cold, hard luxury. Mateo closed the door behind him with a final click. He began unbuttoning his shirt slowly, his eyes never leaving Julia. "Don't make this difficult, Tesoro," he said, his voice calm again, which was even more terrifying. Julia backed away until her spine hit a vanity table. Her hands fumbled behind her. Her fingers brushed against something cold and metallic, a silver fruit bowl containing a small paring knife for apples. Mateo stepped closer. "You're mine. It's time you accepted it." He reached out to grab her again. In one desperate motion fueled by pure terror, Julia grabbed the small knife and swung it forward with all her might. She didn't aim. She just wanted him away. Shk! The knife connected, not in his chest, but in his side, just below the ribs. Mateo went still. He stared at Julia, his eyes wide with shock, not pain, as if he couldn't believe his little bird had just pecked. He took a step back, his hand touching his side. When he pulled it away, his hand was covered in bright, red blood that contrasted sharply with his white shirt. "Julia," he whispered, his voice sounding strange, surprised. Julia dropped the knife. Its clatter was deafening in the silent room. She stared at her own blood-stained hands. "Oh God, what have I done?" Mateo staggered. He fell to his knees, one hand pressing against the wound that was starting to bleed rapidly. His face went pale. Panic washed over Julia like a tidal wave. She didn't think. She didn't check if Mateo was still breathing. She only saw the blood. So much blood. "I killed him. I just killed a mafia boss." Without looking back, Julia ran. She ran out of the bedroom, down the grand staircase, past startled servants who didn't dare stop her. She ran out the magnificent front doors into the cold night. She ran barefoot, her expensive red dress tearing on bushes as she burst through an unlocked side gate. She ran until her lungs burned and her feet bled, away from the villa, away from the monster she might have just killed, back to the only place she knew. 3 days. It had been 3 days since that night. Julia hid inside her trattoria like a cornered rat. All the curtains were drawn tight. The door was locked with 3 different locks, plus a chair wedged under the doorknob. Every sound in the alley outside made her jump. Distant police sirens sent her scrambling under the kitchen table, trembling, waiting for the pounding on the door that would end her life. She was sure Mateo was dead. She had seen the blood. She had seen how he fell. And if he was dead, his men must be looking for her, or the police. She didn't know which was worse. Julia paced the small apartment above the trattoria. She couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Mateo's shocked face and the blood on her hands. She had tried washing her hands dozens of times, scrubbing them until her skin was red and raw, but she still felt dirty. She couldn't leave. Her passport had expired years ago. She didn't have enough cash to get far, and where would she go? Rome was the only home she knew. This trattoria was her only legacy. She was trapped. On the 4th day, her food supplies began to run low. Hunger started to outweigh her fear. She peeked through a crack in the curtains. The alley was quiet. No police cars. No suspicious men in black suits. Was it possible? No one knew. Was it possible Mateo had died alone in his room and hadn't been found yet? The thought was horrifying, but it also offered a sliver of desperate hope. If she kept hiding, people would get suspicious. Her regular customers would start to wonder. The best way to hide was in plain sight. With trembling hands and her heart hammering in her throat, Julia made a decision. She had to survive. She unlocked the door. She pulled back the curtains. She flipped the sign on the door to open. The outside world didn't immediately attack her. The morning sun just shone on the dusty wooden floor of her trattoria. Julia took a deep breath. She would pretend everything was normal. She would cook. She would smile. And she would pray that the ghost of the man she killed wouldn't come to haunt her. A week passed in a haze of anxiety. Julia opened the trattoria every day, smiling stiffly at customers who asked where she had been. Just a mild flu was her standard excuse. Every time the door opened, she held her breath, expecting the police. But it was only hungry tourists and locals looking for lunch. Maybe she had really gotten away with it. It was raining that night, just like the first night Mateo had come. Julia was wiping down the last table, preparing to close. The clock showed past 11. The doorbell jingled. Not the usual soft chime, but a harsh clang as the door was pushed open forcefully. Julia looked up, the rag falling from her hand. 2 large men in black suits entered first. their eyes scanning the empty room with military efficiency. They stood on either side of the door, making way. And then he walked in. Matteo. He was alive, but he looked different. He was paler, with dark shadows under his eyes. He wasn't wearing his usual full suit. He wore a long black wool coat over a bare chest. Thick white bandages wrapped around his ribs, clearly visible beneath the open coat. Julia's knees went weak. An overwhelming sense of relief. He's not dead. I'm not a murderer, mixed with a new, sharper terror. He's alive and he came for me. Matteo walked slowly, with a slight limp, toward his usual corner table. He sat down carefully, wincing slightly as he leaned back. He stared at Julia from across the room. There was no anger in his eyes, only something cold and calculating. Long time no see, tesoro. His voice was hoarse. Julia couldn't move. She was rooted to the spot. I'm hungry, Matteo said as if nothing had happened. Pappardelle. Julia snapped out of her paralysis. Her brain spun frantically. She had to run. The kitchen back door. She could run through there. But the 2 bodyguards were still standing at the front door, their eyes constantly watching her. She would never make it. With violently shaking hands, Julia went into the kitchen. She cooked on autopilot, muscle memory taking over while her mind screamed. She poured the pasta into a bowl, spilling a little sauce because her hands were so unsteady. She brought it to Matteo's table. As she set the bowl down, Matteo's hand shot out. He grabbed Julia's wrist. His grip wasn't as strong as before, but it was enough to hold her. Matteo pulled her a little closer, his eyes boring into hers. No apology? He asked softly. For the new hole in my body, panicked tears welled up in Julia's eyes. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. You forced me. Shh. Matteo placed his index finger on Julia's lips. I know. I pushed you too far, and my little bird pecked. That's fair? He released her hand, then pointed to the bandage on his ribs. But actions have consequences, Julia. You made this mess. He picked up his fork, starting to eat calmly before continuing. I won't go to the police. That would be troublesome for both of us. But someone has to take responsibility. He looked at Julia again, a thin, terrifying smile appearing on his lips. You made it, you fix it. Starting tonight, you are my personal nurse. Until this wound is completely healed, you are mine. And this time, I'll make sure you won't be holding any more knives. Nurse? Julia repeated, her voice barely audible. You heard me, Matteo said, taking another bite of his food. Every night after you close, you will change my bandages, clean the wound, and make sure I don't die from an infection caused by your dirty little fruit knife. Cold guilt washed over Julia. She looked at the bandages again. There was a small red seep there. It was her fault. She had almost killed him. Fine, she whispered, surrendering. It was better than prison, better than death. Matteo smiled in satisfaction. He finished his meal quickly, then pushed his empty plate away. Now, he said, leaning back in his chair and lifting his hands slightly as if helpless. Feed me. Julia blinked. What? Feed me? Matteo repeated, his tone shifting to a horrible mockery of spoiled petulance. My arms hurt if I lift them too high. My ribs ache. Julia stared at him in disbelief. You just finished a whole bowl of pasta by yourself. That was then. Now it hurts again, Matteo said shamelessly. Come on, infermiera. Your patient needs nutrition. He pointed to a bowl of tiramisu that one of his bodyguards had just brought in from the car. With her jaw clenched in annoyance and embarrassment, Julia picked up the spoon. She stood awkwardly beside Matteo, scooping up the tiramisu and feeding it to him. Matteo ate it with a triumphant gleam in his eyes. He was enjoying this. He enjoyed seeing Julia submit to him, not out of fear of violence, but out of guilt. As Julia leaned in for the third spoonful, Matteo's hurt hand suddenly moved. It landed on Julia's thigh, just above her knee. Julia flinched, nearly dropping the spoon. What are you doing? Sorry, Matteo said, not removing his hand. Instead, he gave a gentle squeeze, just looking for something to hold on to. The pain suddenly struck. Your hand can hold on to the table, Julia hissed, trying to back away. It's softer here, Matteo replied casually, his thumb stroking the fabric of Julia's pants. Julia felt her face heat up with anger and something else she didn't want to admit. She was trapped. If she fought back, Matteo could change his mind about the police. She forced herself to finish feeding him, trying to ignore the hot hand on her thigh that moved inch by inch higher with every bite. That night became their new routine. Every night Matteo came. Julia cleaned his wound, an intimate process that required her to touch Matteo's hot bare skin, feeling his muscles tense under her fingers. And every night Matteo would find new ways to touch her, asking for help to stand up, accidentally brushing her waist while she wrapped his bandages, or just staring at her with an intensity that made Julia feel naked. He was the cruelest patient. He was using his own weakness as a new weapon to ensnare Julia tighter than any threat ever could. 2 weeks passed with this strange nursing routine. Tonight was different. Rain poured heavily outside, thunder rumbling in the distance. At exactly 11 o'clock, the door opened. Julia was ready with her first aid kit, but Matteo entered alone. No sullen-faced bodyguards followed him. No black car waited outside with its engine running. Just Matteo, soaked to the bone, his coat heavy with rainwater. He looked awful, not just because of his wound. His face was gray with exhaustion. His eyes, usually sharp and calculating, looked empty and sunken. He didn't sit in his usual chair. He staggered slightly, then slumped into the nearest chair by the door, as if he had no energy to walk any further. He didn't order food. He didn't tease Julia. He just sat there, staring blankly at the wooden floor, wet with drips from his coat. Julia stood behind the cash register, confused. This silence was far more terrifying than his predatory teasing. "Matteo?" she called hesitantly, using his first name for the first time without the signore prefix. Matteo didn't answer. Slowly, driven by curiosity and a strange twinge of concern, Julia approached. "Are you okay?" Matteo finally looked up. His gaze pierced right through Julia, as if seeing something distant and terrible behind her. "They're all the same," he said, his voice hoarse and cracked. "Hungry dogs. You feed them from your hand, and the moment you let your guard down, they bite right down to the bone." He laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "My most trusted man. 10 years he was with me. Today I had to take care of him." He stared at his own hands. There was no blood on them tonight, but Julia knew what he meant. Julia looked at the man before her. She saw the monster wounded, not by her physical knife, but by betrayal. She saw a loneliness so deep it was suffocating. An unwanted pity crept into Julia's heart. She hated this man, but she couldn't see anyone this broken without doing something. Wordlessly, Julia went into the kitchen. She didn't cook pappardelle tonight. It was too heavy. She made a thick, warm minestrone soup, full of vegetables and comforting broth. She brought it to Matteo, kneeling beside his chair. "Eat," she said softly. Matteo stared at the bowl, then at Julia. There was a vulnerability in his eyes Julia had never seen before. He made no move to take the spoon. Julia sighed softly. She scooped up some soup, blew on it slightly, then guided it to Matteo's lips. Matteo opened his mouth mechanically. He swallowed. The warmth of the soup seemed to thaw a little of the ice inside him. Julia fed him, spoonful by spoonful, in a silence that no longer felt threatening but sad. After the bowl was empty, Matteo looked a little more alive. His mask began to return, but it wasn't perfect yet. "Look at you," he murmured, attempting his signature crooked smirk but failing. "Now you're spoiling me, cara mia." Julia was about to retort, but she saw Matteo's hand trembling on the armrest. The man's face hardened again, his jaw clenched tight, his eyes darkening once more with the memory of what he had to do today. The monster might be wounded, but he was still dangerous. And tonight, he looked like a ticking time bomb ready to explode. The rain outside intensified, turning into a storm that battered the trattoria windows. Matteo was still sitting in his chair, staring blankly into the darkness outside. "I can't go home tonight," he said suddenly, his voice low. Julia tensed. "Why? It's too quiet there," Matteo replied, his rare honesty surprising both of them. "If I'm alone tonight, I might burn the place down." He turned to Julia, his eyes pleading wordlessly. "Let me stay here. I'll sleep in this chair." Julia looked at the large man curled up in the hard wooden chair, his wound surely throbbing with pain. She imagined him alone here, haunted by his demons all night. She cursed her overly soft heart. "Don't be stupid," Julia said sharply, masking her pity. "You'll get a backache, and I'll have to hear your complaints tomorrow." She sighed. "My apartment is upstairs. There's only one bed, but it's better than a chair." Matteo's eyes widened slightly, as if he couldn't believe his own offer had been accepted and upgraded. They went up to the small apartment above the trattoria. It was cramped, warm, and smelled of lavender. There was only one queen-sized mattress on the floor in the corner of the room. Matteo stood in the doorway looking too big for the room. "Only one mattress," he said, the corner of his lip twitching up, his old teasing starting to return. "Are you sure about inviting me into your bed, Tesoro? I'm injured, my performance might not be peak." Julia's face turned bright red. "Dirty mind. You sleep on the mattress. I'll sleep on the floor." She turned to get a spare blanket from the closet, but Matteo was already moving. He groaned softly as he lowered himself onto the soft mattress, closing his eyes for a moment in relief. But when Julia placed a pillow on the floor, Matteo opened his eyes. "Don't be ridiculous," he said. He patted the empty space beside him. "Come up here." "I don't want to. Julia, I swear on my broken ribs, I won't touch you. I just need someone nearby." There was a desperate note in his voice that made Julia pause. "Besides," Matteo added, a small smirk appearing again, "the floor is cold. Just think of me as a giant warm bolster, with a little bonus trunk." "Matteo!" "Kidding. Seriously, come up, please." The word please from Matteo's mouth sounded foreign. Julia finally gave in. She lay on the very edge of the mattress, her back to Matteo, her body stiff as a board. Silence for a few moments. Matteo fidgeted beside her. "Do you have any alcohol?" he asked suddenly. "No," Julia replied shortly. Matteo growled in frustration, punching his pillow lightly. He clearly needed something to numb his mind. Julia turned slowly. She saw Matteo staring at the ceiling, his jaw twitching. "Don't look for an escape," Julia said softly. She plucked up the courage, reaching out and touching Matteo's arm. "Talk, just let it out." It was like opening a dam. Slowly at first, then faster, Matteo began to talk. Not about the details of his crimes, but about his feelings. About today's betrayal. About his cold father who taught him that trust was a weakness. About a childhood spent learning how to hurt before being hurt. He talked for hours, his voice sometimes rising in anger, sometimes softening with long-buried sadness. Julia just listened. Occasionally she murmured comforting words, or just squeezed his arm when his voice cracked. Finally his words slowed. His breathing became regular and deep. He had fallen asleep mid-sentence. Julia looked at his sleeping face. The hard lines around his eyes and mouth had softened. He looked much younger, almost peaceful. Unconsciously, Julia gave a small smile. She pulled the blanket higher over Matteo's shoulder, careful not to bump his injured side. She lay back down, this time facing Matteo. The distance between them was only a few inches, but for the first time, that distance didn't feel dangerous. It felt safe.